The book of Genesis. Every great journey has a beginning. Every extraordinary destiny starts with a first step. Every story of redemption is born from an original promise. Welcome to the book of beginnings, Genesis, the gateway that invites us to contemplate not only the origin of the universe, but the birth of God's divine purpose for humanity. Within its ancient pages, we discover not only the creation of the heavens and the earth, but the beginning of the eternal dialogue between the Creator and His most precious creation. Genesis is not merely a record of origins, it is the testimony of the God who reveals Himself, who calls, who promises, and who redeems. Prepare for a journey through primordial time, from the gardens of Eden to the tents of the patriarchs, from the waters of the flood to the bricks of Babel. From the promises made to Abraham to Joseph's tears in Egypt, this is Genesis, where it all began. Creation and the fall. Genesis 1-3. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. A simple sentence, 7 words in Portuguese, and yet within them lies the greatest act imaginable, the birth of everything that exists, not a cosmic accident, not a chemical coincidence, but an intentional act of a personal creator. The Hebrew narrative of Genesis presents a revolutionary truth to the ancient world. One single God, sovereign and loving, who creates with purpose and order. While the neighboring cultures of Israel worshipped the sun, the moon, and the stars, divine revelation showed something extraordinary. These were not gods, but merely lamps created by the powerful word of the one true God. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And what a poetic image! The Hebrew word used here for hovering, reshape, is the same used in Deuteronomy to describe an eagle hovering over its young, protecting them. From the very first moment of creation, we see a God who not only creates, but who cares, who nurtures, who protects. And then the spoken word brings order to chaos. Let there be light. And there was light. In 6 days of creative activity, God transforms emptiness into fullness, the formless into structured beauty. Silence into a symphony of life, and at every step the divine refrain echoes, and God saw that it was good. What does this tell us about the character of our Creator? That He values order, beauty, diversity, the intrinsic goodness of existence. And then, at the pinnacle of creation comes the masterpiece. Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Notice the divine plural, let us. From the very first verses of the Bible, there is a mystery in the nature of God, a plurality within unity that would be fully revealed centuries later in the doctrine of the Trinity. The human being, male and female, is formed from the dust of the earth, yet animated by the very breath of God, matter and spirit. Earth and heaven united in a being capable of knowing its Creator, the only creature made in the image of God, carrying something of the divine nature in its very essence. The Garden of Eden, humanity's first home, a living sanctuary where heaven and earth met, where God walked in the breeze of the day for communion with His beloved creatures. The term Eden in Hebrew suggests delight, pleasure, and abundance. It was a microcosm of the world as it was meant to be, harmony between God, humans, and all creation. Human labor was not a burden, but a creative collaboration with God Himself. At the center of this garden, 2 mysterious trees, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The second came with a single restriction, the first commandment. You shall not eat from it, for in the day you eat from it, you will surely die. And then the serpent's whisper, did God really say that? The first distortion of truth. the first suggestion that God was hiding something good, that his restrictions were petty, that his word could not be trusted. Eve sees, desires, takes, eats, offers to Adam. He eats too. In an instant, everything changes. Their eyes are opened, not to divine wisdom, but to shame. Nakedness, once natural, now exposes them. Immediate communion with God is broken. Fear enters the world for the first time. Where are you? The first question God asks in the Bible. Not because he didn't know, but because he wanted Adam to acknowledge his new reality. Hidden, separated, afraid. The woman you gave me, the serpent deceived me. The first instances of blame shifting in human history. The consequences are pronounced. The serpent is cursed. Childbirth becomes painful. Work becomes toilsome. The harmony between man and woman is wounded by the desire to dominate. And then, physical separation from the garden, cherubim with flaming swords guarding the way to the tree of life. Exile begins. But even in the darkness of judgment, a light shines. In Genesis 3:15, God declares what theologians call the protoevangelium. The first promise of the gospel, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. Contained within this mysterious promise was the entire future story of redemption. A descendant of the woman, Christ, would one day crush the serpent's head, destroying the power of evil, even though he himself would be wounded in the process. The cross already cast its shadow from the Garden of Eden. And there is yet another sign of grace. Before expelling them from the garden, the Lord God made garments of skin for Adam and his wife and clothed them. The first sacrifice, the first deaths. Innocent animals giving their lives and their skins to cover human shame. A foreshadowing of the final sacrifice that would one day cover not only shame, but the sin of all humanity. What does this ancient story of creation and fall mean for us today? In a world that often reduces human beings to mere biological accidents, Genesis reminds us of our innate dignity as bearers of God's image. No matter your appearance, your abilities, your social status, you carry something divine within your being. Your existence was not an accident, but an intentional act of creative love. This truth transformed the view of humanity. If every person bears the divine image, then every life has immeasurable value. The weak, the marginalized, the unborn, the elderly, all reflect, even if imperfectly, something of God himself. And what about the fall? Is this not a truth that echoes in our daily experience? We feel this conflict within ourselves. We know the good we ought to do, but we often choose another path. We long for a world of perfect justice and love, yet we contribute to its brokenness. Paul wrote to the Romans, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. This is not merely an abstract theological statement. It is an accurate description of the human condition that we see in ourselves and in the world around us. But the story does not end with the fall. From the very beginning, God was already working out his plan of restoration. How do you deal with your own falls, with your failures, with your lost Eden moments? Remember, the same God who covered the nakedness of Adam and Eve continues to cover our shame today. The same God who promised a Redeemer in the garden fulfilled his promise on the cross. The story that began in Genesis finds its fulfillment in Jesus. Ask yourself, where am I trying to hide from God today? What fig leaves, what inadequate coverings am I using to mask my true condition? And am I willing to trade those fragile coverings for the garments of righteousness that only He can provide? The account of creation in Genesis contains riches that often go unnoticed by the casual reader. For example, Did you know that the 7-day pattern described in Genesis 1 served as the foundation for the 7-day week we still use today? This pattern was unique among ancient cultures. While other peoples based their calendars solely on lunar or solar cycles, Israel incorporated this 7-day rhythm, which has no astronomical basis, but a theological one, reflecting the very rhythm of the Creator. Another fascinating detail, the Hebrew term used for created in the first verse, bara, is used exclusively in the Bible for God's creative activity. It is never used to describe human action. It suggests creation out of nothing, ex nihilo, something only God can do. Modern archaeology has confirmed that several cultures from the ancient Near East had their own creation and flood narratives. The Babylonian Enuma Elish and the Epic of Gilgamesh are the most well-known examples. However, the differences are revealing. While these stories depict capricious gods creating humans to be their slaves, Genesis presents a loving God creating humans in his image to share his rule over creation. Theologically, it is significant that the Bible begins with creation, not redemption. This establishes a fundamental truth. Before we are sinners in need of salvation, we are God's creatures, made for relationship with him. Our most fundamental identity is not our sin, but our creation in the divine image. The early church fathers often noted the connection between the tree in Eden and the cross of Calvary. Irenaeus of Lyon wrote, "What we lost in Adam, the image and likeness of God, we recovered in Christ. The wood that brought death through the forbidden fruit finds its counterpart in the wood that brings life through the supreme sacrifice. From Cain to Babel." Genesis 4:11. The exile from the garden was only the beginning of the separation between humanity and its creator. The seed of sin planted in Eden quickly blossomed into open violence. Cain and Abel, the first sons of Adam and Eve, one a tiller of the soil, the other a shepherd of sheep. Both bring offerings to God, a recognition that even outside the garden, humanity still sought connection with the divine. But the Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. The Bible does not fully explain the reason for the acceptance of one offering and the rejection of the other. Hebrews 11:4 suggests the difference was faith. In Genesis, we see only the reaction, Cain's fallen face, and God's warning, "If you do what is right, will you not be accepted?" But Cain's heart was already poisoned by envy. In the field, away from the eyes of his parents, he attacks his brother, the first murder, the first human blood shed by human hands. "The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground." Sin, which began as disobedience in the garden, now evolves into open violence. Cain is cursed to wander, separated even further from God, marked yet paradoxically protected by the Creator, who in his mercy still preserves the life of one who took a life. Generations pass, sin multiplies. 7 generations from Adam through Cain's line, we meet Lamech, the first polygamist recorded in the Bible, boasting of having killed a man for wounding him. If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. Violence becomes institutionalized. Human pride grows, the separation from God deepens. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. What a devastating description, not just outward actions, but the inner thoughts of the human heart continually bent toward evil. And then the divine decision that sounds so difficult to modern ears, the flood. Not an act of divine cruelty, but of painful justice in the face of total corruption. Like a surgeon removing gangrenous tissue to save the patient, God acts to preserve the possibility of redemption. But even in judgment, grace shines. Noah, a righteous man in his generation, finds favor in the eyes of God. The ark is built, a floating refuge where the promise of creation would be preserved. 40 days and 40 nights of rain. The floodgates of heaven are opened. The springs of the deep burst forth. The waters rise and cover even the highest mountains. Every living creature on the earth perishes. For an entire year, Noah and his family float upon the waters of judgment, carrying the seeds of a new beginning. The ark, a kind of mobile Eden, preserving life amid death. And then finally, the new beginning. The raven that does not return, the dove that returns with an olive leaf, the first sign of new life. The waters recede, the ark rests, the family and the animals emerge into a world cleansed, purified. Noah's first act, to build an altar, to offer sacrifice, to seek the face of God. And God's response, a solemn promise marked by the rainbow in the sky. Never again will I destroy all living creatures as I have done. A new beginning, a second chance for humanity. The same original blessings repeated. Be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. A covenant established not only with humans, but with every living creature. The bow in the sky, God's war bow hung in the clouds, pointing away from the earth, a sign of peace between the Creator and His creation. But the flood, while cleansing the earth, did not cleanse the human heart. Soon we see Noah, the righteous man, drunk and exposed in his tent. Ham dishonoring his father. The curse pronounced upon Canaan. The cycle of sin continues, even after the judgment of the waters. And finally, we arrive at Babel. Humanity united by one language, by one vision, but not by divine purpose. Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, and make a name for ourselves so that we won't be scattered over the face of the whole earth. The problem was not the construction itself, but the motivation. Let us make a name for ourselves, in direct contrast to the call of Abraham soon to come, to whom God promises, I will make your name great. Seeking glory for oneself versus receiving it as a divine gift, two fundamentally opposed spiritual orientations. God's intervention at Babel was not primarily a punishment, but an act of mercy. By confusing their language, he prevented humanity united in rebellion from causing even greater harm. The dispersion of nations, seen as a human tragedy, was actually part of the original purpose. Fill the earth. Chapters 1:11 of Genesis show us repeated cycles: creation, fall, judgment, grace. From Eden to the ark, from the ark to Babel, the narrative moves from all creation to all humanity, and now it will narrow to focus on one specific family through whom God will begin his plan of global redemption. The stories of Cain and Abel, of the flood, and of the Tower of Babel are not mere accounts of a distant past. They are mirrors where we see reflected the same human tendencies that persist to this day. The envy that consumed Cain still poisons relationships. How do we respond when others are favored or recognized instead of us? God's question to Cain echoes through the centuries. Why are you angry? Why has your face fallen? How often does our wounded pride turn into resentment, and resentment into destructive words or actions? Cain's path remains a solemn warning about the progression of sin when we allow it to take root in our hearts. And what about the flood? This challenging story confronts us with the reality of a God who is not only loving, but also just. A God who takes sin so seriously that he cannot simply ignore it. But notice, The same God who shut the door of the ark is the one who first opened it as a path of salvation. Judgment is never God's first or last word. It is always preceded by warnings and followed by grace. The rainbow remains in the sky to this day, a reminder that we live under the promise of divine patience. Peter writes that God is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance. The Tower of Babel speaks directly to our age of technological achievements and grand ambitions. There is nothing wrong with building, creating, advancing. These are expressions of God's image in us. The problem arises when our accomplishments become monuments to our own ego, when we seek to make a name for ourselves apart from God. Ask yourself, what am I building in my life? A tower for my own glory or an altar for the glory of God? Am I seeking to make my own name great or to magnify the name of the Lord? The antidote to the spirit of Babel is found in the words of John the Baptist. He must increase and I must decrease. When we understand that our true greatness lies in glorifying God, not ourselves, we find the freedom that Babel sought but could never attain. The narratives in this section of Genesis are filled with fascinating details that enrich our understanding. For example, the name Abel in Hebrew, Hevel, means vapor or breath, a prophetic allusion to the brevity of his life. Cain, on the other hand, is related to the word to acquire or to forge, possibly indicating Eve's hope that he would be the promised descendant who would crush the serpent's head. What tragic irony that instead he became the first human agent of death. The story of the flood has parallels in many cultures around the world. Over 200 flood narratives have been documented globally, many with strikingly similar elements. A righteous man is warned, builds a boat, animals are preserved, a bird is sent to search for land. Critics see this as evidence against the historicity of the biblical account, but it could be just the opposite. These diverse cultural memories may point to a real cataclysmic event that left an indelible mark on the collective human memory. The dimensions of the ark given in Genesis, 300 cubits long, 50 wide, and 30 high, result in a 30:3 ratio. Modern naval architecture studies confirm that these proportions would create an extremely stable vessel, capable of withstanding massive waves without capsizing. It is remarkable that these ideal proportions appear in a text written thousands of years before modern naval science. As for Babel, excavations in Mesopotamia have revealed structures known as ziggurats, pyramid-shaped towers with temples on top. The Etemenanke, a ziggurat dedicated to the god Marduk in Babylon, is often associated with the biblical Tower of Babel. Its name means house of the foundation of heaven and earth, a striking echo of the desire described in Genesis to build a tower whose top reaches the heavens. Theologically, it is fascinating to observe how Jesus reverses the trajectory of Babel in Acts 2. At Babel, different languages separated humanity. At Pentecost, the Holy Spirit enables people of different tongues to understand the same message, the beginning of the reunification of the human family under the lordship of Christ. The patriarchs, Abraham and Isaac, Genesis 12-26. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Leave your country, your kindred, and your father's house, and go to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing." With these words, a new phase in the story of redemption begins. After the cycles of sin and judgment in the first 11 chapters, God initiates his rescue plan through one man, Abram, whose name would later be changed to Abraham. Notice the progression of the call: leave your country, and already difficult, leave your kindred, even more challenging. Abandon your father's house, breaking from the deepest sources of cultural identity and security. God's call often requires us to release increasingly deeper layers of security to embrace his promise. Abram obeys, though only partially at first. He brings along Lot, his nephew, contrary to the instruction to leave his kindred. This incomplete obedience would generate future complications, a pattern we see repeated in the patriarchal stories. Abram's journey leads him to Canaan, the land of promise, but also a land of famine. An immediate test of faith. He barely arrives in the promised land and already must go down to Egypt in search of food. In Egypt, fear overtakes faith. "Say you are my sister," the first of two occasions in which Abram puts Sarah at risk to protect his own life. A half-truth that, in reality, was a full lie in intention. Even the father of faith had moments of deep moral failure. Paradoxically, Abram leaves Egypt materially richer but spiritually compromised. The wealth he acquires includes an Egyptian servant named Hagar, who would become a source of further trials and tribulations. Back in Canaan, the separation from Lot finally occurs, not driven by obedience to God, but by conflict between their herdsmen. Lot chooses the fertile plains near Sodom, drawn by apparent prosperity, unaware of the spiritual danger. It is after this separation that God renews his promise to Abram. "Lift up your eyes and look from where you are to the north, to the south, to the east, and to the west. For all the land that you see, I will give to you and your descendants forever. I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth." Abram's life was not one of contemplative isolation, but of engagement with the world around him. When kings from the east capture Lot in the first war recorded in the Bible, Abram becomes a warrior, assembling 318 trained men for a daring rescue. His victory brings him before two contrasting figures, the king of Sodom, offering riches, and Melchizedek, the mysterious king of Salem and priest of God Most High, offering bread, wine, and blessing. Abram refuses the spoils of Sodom, not even a thread or the strap of a sandal, while accepting Melchizedek's blessing and giving him a tithe. Two conflicting spiritual orientations, two possible loyalties, and Abram's choice reveals his heart. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision, saying, "Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield and your exceedingly great reward." The divine promise echoes, but Abram voices his deepest doubt. "Lord God, what will you give me, seeing that I remain childless? How can someone be the father of a great nation when he doesn't even have an heir? Look now toward the heavens and count the stars. If you are able to number them, so shall your descendants be." And then, the verse that would change the course of redemptive history. Abram believed the Lord, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Paul and James would later build deep theological reflections upon this simple declaration. Justification by faith, the foundational principle of salvation, was already present in Abraham's story. Not by works, not by circumcision, not by ritual observance, but by trust in God's promise. God seals this promise with an extraordinary covenant ceremony. Animals are cut in half, with a path laid between the pieces. Normally, both parties of a covenant would walk between the divided animals, committing themselves to suffer the same fate if the covenant was broken. But here, only God, represented by a smoking firepot and a blazing torch, passes between the pieces. It is a unilateral covenant, dependent solely on divine faithfulness, not human perfection. 10 years pass. The promise remains unfulfilled. Abram and Sarai's faith wavers. Go in, I pray you, to my servant. Perhaps I shall obtain children by her. The human plan to help God fulfill his promise. Hagar conceives. Conflict arises between the women. Ishmael is born, a son of the flesh, not of the promise. The consequences of this decision still reverberate today in the conflict between the descendants of Isaac and Ishmael. As so often happens, human solutions to divine delays create generational problems. At 99 years old, God renews his covenant with Abram. New names are given. Abram becomes Abraham, father of multitudes. Sarai becomes Sarah, princess. Circumcision is instituted as the physical sign of the spiritual covenant. God's timing is about to be fulfilled. 3 mysterious visitors appear at the door of Abraham's tent. Hospitality is offered, a meal is prepared, and then the promise is renewed with a specific timeline. About this time next year, Sarah will have a son. Sarah laughs, not a laugh of joy, but of disbelief. Shall I have pleasure being old and my Lord also old? The visitor, now clearly identified as the Lord himself, responds with the question that echoes through the ages to all who doubt. Is anything too hard for the Lord? The conversation then takes an unexpected turn. God reveals to Abraham his plan to judge Sodom and Gomorrah. What follows is one of the most extraordinary dialogues in the Bible. Abraham, dust and ashes, interceding with the judge of all the earth, appealing to his justice and mercy. If there are 50 righteous in the city, if 45, if 40, 30, 20, 10. Abraham stops at 10, perhaps thinking of Lot and his family. The Lord agrees to spare the city for the sake of 10 righteous, but not even 10 are found. The cities of the plain are destroyed. Lot is rescued but loses his wife and ends up in a cave, where his final descendants are conceived through an incestuous act with his own daughters. Another tragic story born from moral compromise and the choice to live on the edges of Sodom. The Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had promised. Sarah conceived and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the appointed time of which God had spoken to him. Sarah's laugh of disbelief becomes a laugh of joy. God has made me laugh. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. The name of the promised son reflects this transformation. Isaac, which means he laughs. The feast of weaning, Ishmael mocking, the inevitable conflict. Cast out this slave woman and her son. Sarah's words, harsh but necessary, are confirmed by God himself to a reluctant Abraham. Hagar and Ishmael in the desert. The water runs out. A mother's despair. And then divine intervention, a promise for Ishmael as well. Not the same as Isaac's promise, but still a blessing. I will make of him a great nation. And then the ultimate test. Take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah. Offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will show you. Imagine the shock of those words. The son of the promise, the son of laughter, the son for whom Abraham had waited 100 years. The son through whom the entire divine promise would be fulfilled. And now, the command to sacrifice him. 3 days of journey, 3 days of agonizing reflection, 3 days carrying the weight of an incomprehensible command. But Abraham presses on, sustained by a faith that had now matured through decades of waiting and testing. Isaac asks, "Where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham's answer reveals the depth of his faith. God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. Hebrews tells us that Abraham considered that God was able even to raise Isaac from the dead. His faith had grown to the point of trusting that even if he had to sacrifice Isaac, God would still fulfill his promise through him. The climactic moment. Isaac bound on the altar, the knife raised. And then the voice from heaven, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." A ram caught by its horns in the thicket, the substitute provided. Isaac spared, and a new name for God is revealed, Jehovah-Jireh, the Lord will provide. This Mount Moriah, according to Jewish tradition, would later be the site where Solomon's temple was built. And near it, another hill, Calvary, where another son, the only begotten of the Father, would be offered with no intervention, no substitute, fulfilling once and for all what was foreshadowed in Isaac's near sacrifice. The final chapters of Abraham's life include the death and burial of Sarah. The first property acquired in the Promised Land is, ironically, a burial site. The mission to find a wife for Isaac, not from the daughters of Canaan, but from Abraham's kin. And finally, the death of the patriarch himself at 175 years old and full of days, gathered to his ancestors. Isaac inherits not only his father's possessions, but the mantle of the divine promise. It now falls to him to continue the journey of faith begun by Abraham. Isaac's life is presented in Genesis as a bridge between Abraham and Jacob. Less dramatic than his father's or his sons, his story is marked by waiting, passivity, and the repetition of family patterns. Like his father, Isaac faces famine in the Promised Land. Like his father, he lies about his wife, calling her his sister. Like his father, he experiences conflict between his sons. But there are also important distinctions. Isaac prays for the end of Rebekah's barrenness, and his prayer is answered. The twins, Esau and Jacob, struggle already in the womb, a foreshadowing of the conflict that would mark their lives. Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples will be separated from within you. One people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. Another divine reversal of the natural order. Another example of the principle Paul would later articulate. It does not depend on human desire or effort, but on God who has mercy. Esau, the skilled hunter, loved by his father. Jacob, the quiet man, dwelling in tents, his mother's favorite. The birthright sold for a bowl of stew, eternal values exchanged for momentary satisfaction. The famous scene of deception, Jacob pretending to be Esau to receive the paternal blessing, Rebekah orchestrating the scheme, Isaac with failing eyesight being deceived, the blessing pronounced over the wrong son, or was it the right son according to the prophecy? Esau's fury, the threat of death. Jacob sent away to Laban's house, a departure that seemed temporary, but would last 20 years. Thus ends Isaac's cycle in Genesis, with his favored son disinherited and his less favored son fleeing for his life. The divine plan advances not through human perfection, but despite human flaws and fragility. The stories of Abraham and Isaac serve as a mirror to our own faith journey. In Abraham, we see the divine call and the human response in all its complexity. God's call often asks us to leave something behind: comfort, security, family identity, personal plans. Like Abraham, we are invited to walk not by sight but by faith, toward a land God will show us. Notice how Abraham's faith wasn't perfect from the start, but grew through trials and failures. He lied about Sarah in Egypt. He tried to help God through Hagar. He doubted the possibility of having a child in old age. His faith was real, but it was also a faith in progress, just like ours. Faith is not the absence of doubts, but trust in God in spite of them. It's not instant moral perfection, but a journey of growth in obedience. The long wait for the promised son teaches us something profound about God's timing. In our age of instant gratification, the idea of waiting 25 years for the fulfillment of a divine promise seems almost unbearable, yet it is often in the waiting that our character is formed. It is in the waiting that we learn to trust not in our solutions, but in God's promises. It is in the waiting that our faith is purified of self-centered agendas. And what about the ultimate test? The command to sacrifice Isaac is not just a story from another time, but an invitation to examine our own Isaacs, those gifts, relationships, or dreams that God has given us, but that can become idols when we love them more than the giver. The fundamental question is, do we trust the giver more than the gift? Are we willing to surrender even what we love most if God asks? Not because he wants to deprive us of joy, but because he wants to be our supreme joy. The ram caught by its horns in the thicket foreshadows the central truth of the gospel, that God provides the substitute. Just as Isaac was spared by the ram, we are spared through the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. As for Isaac and the conflict between his sons, we see how family patterns, both positive and negative, tend to repeat across generations. The parental favoritism Isaac showed Esau was the same favoritism Jacob would later show to Joseph, creating cycles of pain and conflict. Ask yourself, what patterns am I repeating from my own family history? What spiritual legacies am I passing on to the next generation? How can I, by God's grace, break negative cycles and strengthen positive legacies? Finally, remember, even when the patriarchs failed, and they failed often, God remained faithful. This is the golden thread running through all these stories. Not human faithfulness, but divine faithfulness. Not man's wavering commitment, but God's unshakable covenant. The story of Abraham is filled with fascinating details that enrich our understanding. For example, archaeologists have discovered that the practice of a barren wife offering her servant to bear children, as Sarah did with Hagar, is documented in marriage contracts from ancient Mesopotamia, particularly in the Nusi tablets, dated to the 2nd millennium BC. These contracts also specified that the wife retained authority over any child born from such an arrangement, exactly as we see in the relationship between Sarah and Hagar. Abraham's original name, Abram, means exalted father, while his new name, Abraham, means father of multitudes. Similarly, Sarai can be translated as my princess, perhaps indicating her status in her father's household, while Sarah simply means princess. Now her identity is no longer derived from her family of origin, but from her divine calling as matriarch. The cities of Sodom and Gomorrah have fascinated archaeologists for centuries. Though their exact location remains debated, excavations in the southeastern region of the Dead Sea have revealed evidence of urban settlements abruptly destroyed around 1700 BC, showing signs of intense conflagration. Some researchers suggest that an earthquake may have released natural deposits of bitumen and sulfur, creating a literal rain of fire and brimstone, as described in the biblical text. The name Melchizedek means King of Righteousness, and he is identified as King of Salem, possibly an early form of Jerusalem. The author of Hebrews develops a profound theology around this enigmatic figure, seeing him as a type of Christ, a priesthood superior to that of Aaron, without recorded beginning or end, offering bread and wine as symbols that prefigure the Eucharist. When Abraham believed the Lord and it was credited to him as righteousness, the standard was set for justification by faith, a truth that would be fully revealed in Christ. Paul uses this example in Romans 4 to show that Abraham was justified before circumcision, before the law, simply by faith in God's promise. a powerful argument for the inclusion of the Gentiles in the family of faith. The drama on Mount Moriah echoes on multiple levels throughout the Bible. Isaac carrying the wood for his own sacrifice foreshadows Christ carrying his cross. The term used for only son, Yaqid in Hebrew, is the same used in Psalm 22:20, "Deliver my soul from the sword, my precious life from the power of the dog," a psalm often seen as messianic, pointing to the cross. There is a fascinating detail often lost in translation. When the angel stops the sacrifice, he says, "Now I know that you fear God." Mbigis, the Hebrew word for know here, is yada, experiential knowledge, not merely theoretical. God had always known theoretically that Abraham feared him, but now that faith had been demonstrated in concrete experience, it is a reminder that our faith must also move from theoretical knowledge to practical demonstration. Jacob and Joseph. Genesis 27-50. Jacob flees. The deceiver now fears being killed by his deceived brother. Alone in the desert between Beersheba and Haran, he stops to spend the night. A stone serves as a pillow, and then the dream that would change his life. Behold, a ladder was set on the earth with its top reaching to heaven, and behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, "I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac." The covenant promise is renewed to the third generation. The deceiver, the fugitive, the man of questionable character, still chosen by God to carry the promise, not by merit, but by grace. How awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. Jacob sets up the stone that served as his pillow, pours oil on it, and calls the place Bethel, house of God. A vow is made. If God will be with me, then the Lord shall be my God. A conditional vow, still revealing Jacob's calculating nature. His transformation would be a long process. In the land of his ancestors, Jacob meets Rachel at the well, an echo of the meeting between Isaac and Rebekah a generation earlier. Love at first sight. "I will serve 7 years for Rachel." And so he serves, and they seemed to him but a few days because of the love he had for her. But the deceiver is deceived. After the wedding night, he discovers it is not Rachel, but Leah in his tent. Laban, shielding himself with local custom, "It is not done in our place to give the younger before the firstborn," forces Jacob to work another 7 years for Rachel. The rivalry between the sisters produces a competition for children. Leah gives Jacob 4 sons, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Rachel, barren, offers her servant Bilhah, who bears Dan and Naphtali. Leah responds by offering her servant Zilpah, who bears Gad and Asher. Leah then conceives again, bearing Issachar and Zebulun, and a daughter, Dinah. Finally, Rachel conceives and bears Joseph. 12 sons and 1 daughter. The future 12 tribes of Israel begin to take shape, born from 4 different mothers, in circumstances of competition and conflict. Once again, the divine plan advances not through human perfection, but despite human dysfunction. After 20 years of service to Laban, Jacob decides to return to the Promised Land. A final negotiation with his father-in-law results in a plan to divide the flocks, seemingly unfavorable to Jacob, but through a combination of selective breeding and possibly divine intervention, he gains great prosperity. The departure is planned in secret. Rachel steals her father's household idols. Laban pursues and catches up with Jacob's caravan. Accusations are made. The idols are not found, hidden beneath the saddle where Rachel is sitting, claiming to be on her menstrual period. A deep irony of powerless idols hidden under ritual impurity. A non-aggression pact is established between Jacob and Laban. A boundary is set. The family conflict is temporarily resolved, but a greater confrontation awaits Jacob. Esau comes to meet him with 400 men. Fear grips the patriarch's heart. Gifts are sent to appease his brother's wrath. The family is divided into groups, so that at least some might escape if there is an attack. And then the night of transformation. Alone at the ford of Jabbok, Jacob encounters a mysterious opponent, a struggle that lasts until dawn. "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The divine question, "What is your name?" Not because the opponent didn't know it, but because Jacob needed to confess, "I am Jacob, the deceiver, the supplanter." "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have struggled with God and with men and have prevailed." A new identity, a new name, a new nature. The deceiver becomes the prince of God, but the struggle leaves marks. Jacob limps after his encounter with God. The deepest blessings often come through our most painful wounds. Our strength is often born from our acknowledged weakness. The dreaded meeting with Esau becomes reconciliation, embraces, tears, forgiveness. The once separated brothers, now reunited. It is not explained what changed Esau's heart. Perhaps 20 years of maturing, perhaps the gift sent by Jacob, perhaps direct divine intervention. But the result is unexpected grace in place of feared revenge. Jacob settles near Shechem, buying land, building an altar. A pause in the patriarch's journey. But the family drama continues. Dinah, Jacob's daughter, is violated by the local prince. Her brothers Simeon and Levi deceive the Shechemites, leading them to circumcise themselves as a condition for intertribal marriage, only to attack them while they are incapacitated by pain, massacring all the men of the city. Violence begets violence. The cycle of deception continues in the next generation. God calls Jacob to return to Bethel, the place of his first encounter with the divine. It is a moment of family purification. "Put away the foreign gods that are among you, purify yourselves, and change your garments." A mini-spiritual reform takes place. Idols are buried. The family renews its commitment to the one true God. Rachel dies giving birth to Benjamin. "Son of my sorrow," she calls him, but Jacob renames him "son of my right hand." The beloved wife passes, leaving two sons who would become central to the unfolding story. And now begins the most detailed narrative in Genesis, the saga of Joseph, Jacob's favorite son, born of his beloved Rachel. Israel loved Joseph more than all his sons because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a coat of many colors. Parental favoritism, the same pattern that caused so much suffering in the previous generation, now repeats, stirring jealousy among the brothers. Joseph's dreams, sheaves bowing to his sheaf, sun, moon, and 11 stars bowing to him, only intensify their resentment. The young man's lack of sensitivity in sharing these dreams of dominance suggests a youthful arrogance that would need to be refined through suffering. The brothers conspire. Joseph is thrown into a cistern. Judah suggests selling him instead of killing him, a partial mercy driven by financial gain. Ishmaelite merchants take him to Egypt. The coat is dipped in animal blood. The lie is told to their father. Jacob, the former deceiver, is now deeply deceived by his own sons. Surely a wild animal has devoured him. Joseph has been torn to pieces. Jacob's inconsolable lament. "In mourning I will go down to my son into the grave." In Egypt, Joseph is sold to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh. His integrity and competence elevate him to the position of overseer of the entire household. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he became a prosperous man. Potiphar's wife casts her eyes on the handsome young Hebrew. Daily invitations to adultery. Joseph's righteous response, "How then could I do such a great evil and sin against God?" Rejection leads to false accusation. The tunic left in the hands of the temptress becomes fabricated evidence. Joseph is thrown into prison, the second pit of his life. First thrown in by his brothers, now by a scorned woman. Even in prison, Joseph's character shines. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. Once again he becomes an administrator, now over the affairs of the prison. Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker, also imprisoned, have dreams. Joseph interprets them correctly. The cupbearer would be restored, the baker executed. "Remember me when it goes well with you," Joseph pleads. But the cupbearer, once restored, forgets the Hebrew interpreter for 2 long years. Pharaoh has troubling dreams: 7 fat cows devoured by 7 thin cows, 7 full ears of grain consumed by 7 withered ears. No one in the court can interpret them. Finally, the cupbearer remembers, "I know a young Hebrew in prison." Joseph is brought from prison, shaved, dressed in clean clothes, and presented before the most powerful monarch on earth. "I've heard it said you can interpret dreams." Joseph's reply reveals his growth in humility. "It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace." The dreams are interpreted. 7 years of great abundance, followed by 7 years of severe famine. Joseph not only interprets, but offers a plan of action. Store 1/5 of the produce during the years of plenty as a reserve for the years of scarcity. Can we find anyone like this man, in whom is the Spirit of God? Pharaoh recognizes divine wisdom in Joseph and instantly promotes him from prisoner to prime minister. "Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you." A new Egyptian name is given, Zaphanath-Paneah. An Egyptian wife, Asenath, daughter of a priest. 2 sons are born, Manasseh. "God has made me forget all my toil and all my father's house." And Ephraim, "God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction." Joseph implements his plan. For 7 years, surplus grain is stored, and Joseph gathered grain like the sand of the sea in great abundance until he stopped counting, for it could not be measured. Then the famine comes, not only in Egypt, but throughout the region. There was famine in all lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. The world comes to Egypt seeking food, and among the hungry are 10 of Joseph's brothers, traveling from southern Canaan, sent by the aged Jacob. Only Benjamin, the youngest son of Rachel, remains with their father. The brothers bow down before Joseph, a literal fulfillment of the dreams they once despised. They do not recognize the brother they sold as a slave 22 years earlier, but he recognizes them. What follows is an elaborate test. Joseph accuses them of being spies. He demands proof of their family story. Simeon is held as a hostage. The others are sent back with the demand that they bring the youngest brother. To deepen their confusion, Joseph orders that the money they brought be secretly returned in their grain sacks, an act that terrifies them. "What is this that God has done to us?" Jacob refuses to let Benjamin go. "My son shall not go down with you, for his brother is dead, and he alone is left. If harm should befall him on the journey you are taking, you would bring my gray hairs with sorrow to the grave." But the famine persists. Finally, Judah offers himself as a guarantee for Benjamin's safety. "I will be surety for him. From my hand you shall require him." Jacob relents. The brothers return to Egypt with Benjamin. A banquet is prepared in Joseph's house. Strange honors are given. They are seated in order of age, and Benjamin receives 5 times more food than the others. a final test is arranged. A silver cup is secretly placed in Benjamin's sack. The group sets out for home, only to be overtaken by Egyptian guards accusing them of theft. The cup is found with Benjamin. Despair overwhelms the brothers. They return to the city and throw themselves to the ground before Joseph. Judah, who once suggested selling Joseph as a slave, now offers himself in Benjamin's place. Now, therefore, please let your servant remain instead of the boy as a slave to my lord, and let the boy go up with his brothers. For how can I bear to see the evil that would come upon my father? It is the moment of revelation. Joseph can no longer restrain himself. He orders all the Egyptians to leave the room. I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? The brothers are stunned. Unable to answer, terror grips them. The brother they sold as a slave now holds the power of life and death over them. Music of reconciliation, grace. But instead of revenge, Joseph offers grace. Now, therefore, do not be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. It was not you who sent me here, but God. Tears of reconciliation, embraces between brothers separated for decades, kisses of forgiveness where once there was betrayal. Joseph sends his brothers back with carts, provisions, and an invitation to bring Jacob and the entire family to Egypt, where they will be sustained through the remaining 5 years of famine. Joseph is still alive, and he is governor over all the land of Egypt. The news leaves Jacob stunned, unbelieving, but upon seeing the Egyptian carts, his spirit revives. It is enough. Joseph, my son, is still alive. I will go and see him before I die. 70 souls go down to Egypt. Israel, Jacob, travels with his entire family and all his possessions to the land of Goshen in the Nile Delta, designated by Joseph as the new dwelling place for the Hebrews and their flocks. The reunion between father and son. Now I can die, since I have seen your face, that you are still alive. Jacob would live 17 more years in a foreign land. Meanwhile, Joseph administers Egypt with wisdom during the famine. Grain is first sold for money, then for livestock, and finally for land. In the end, the land became Pharaoh's, with the exception of the land of the priests. A taxation system is established, 1/5 of all production for Pharaoh, 4/5 for the producers. Joseph lays the economic foundation of Egypt that would last for centuries. Sensing his end drawing near, Jacob requests to be buried not in Egypt, but in the cave of Machpelah in Canaan, where Abraham, Isaac, Sarah, Rebekah, and Leah were buried. Before dying, he blesses Joseph's sons. Once again, a reversal occurs. Ephraim the younger receives the right hand, the greater blessing. Manasseh the firstborn receives the secondary blessing. When Joseph tries to correct it, Jacob insists, I know, my son, I know. He also shall become a people, and he also shall be great. But truly his younger brother shall be greater than he. In Genesis chapter 49, we find Jacob's final blessings over his 12 sons, one of the most poetic and prophetic texts of the book. Not simple blessings, but prophetic declarations about the future of each tribe. Reuben, the firstborn, loses his preeminence due to moral instability. Simeon and Levi are scattered because of their violence. But to Judah, a special blessing. The scepter shall not depart from Judah until Shiloh comes, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. A messianic prophecy pointing to the one who would come from the tribe of Judah, the lion and the lamb. Jacob dies at 147 years old. A great funeral procession, Egyptians and Hebrews together, carries his body back to Canaan to be buried with his fathers. With Jacob gone, the brothers fear Joseph will now seek revenge. They send a message claiming that Jacob, before dying, asked Joseph to forgive them. Joseph's response reveals deep spiritual maturity. "Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended evil against me, but God intended it for good, to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive." Joseph lives to be 110 years old, seeing the third generation of his descendants. Before dying, he extracts a promise from his brothers: "God will surely visit you, and you shall carry my bones from here." Like his father, Joseph knew Egypt was not the final destination for God's people. His bones were to await the return to the promised land, a wait of more than 400 years, until Moses would carry them during the Exodus. Thus ends Genesis, the book of beginnings. Not with a conclusion, but with an unfulfilled promise. Not with a period, but with a comma, a pause between the divine call and its full fulfillment. Jacob's family is now in Egypt, not in Canaan. Joseph is in a coffin, not in a tomb in the promised land. The story feels unfinished because it is only the first chapter of a broader narrative of redemption still unfolding. The stories of Jacob and Joseph are rich with applications for our spiritual lives today. In Jacob, we see the process of divine transformation. His name means supplanter, deceiver, and for many years he lived up to that name. Manipulative, calculating, always seeking an advantage. But God did not leave him that way. Through encounters, struggles, losses, and gains, God transformed Jacob into Israel, he who wrestles with God. The fundamental question for us is, are we allowing God to transform our character even when the process is painful? Note that Jacob's transformation did not happen all at once. Even after his encounter at Jabbok, he continued to wrestle with old habits and patterns. Transformation is a process, not a one-time event. What an encouragement for us, who often struggle with the same faults repeatedly. Jacob's wrestling with God teaches us something profound about our own spiritual journey. Sometimes the greatest blessings come through struggle, not escape. Jacob could have fled the mysterious wrestler in the darkness, but he chose to stay, to cling, to demand the blessing. "I will not let you go unless you bless me." This powerful declaration reflects a persistent faith, a refusal to settle for anything less than the fullness of God's blessing. Are we willing to wrestle in prayer like that, to not settle for superficial spirituality? As for Joseph, his story teaches us about faithfulness in trials. In every situation, sold as a slave, falsely accused, forgotten in prison, he maintained his integrity. He did not grow bitter, did not compromise his values, did not abandon his faith in the God of his fathers. The secret of Joseph is revealed repeatedly in the phrase, "The Lord was with Joseph." Dasu. This divine presence did not exempt him from hardship, but sustained him through it. How do we respond when our pits and prisons seem endless? Can we recognize God's presence even in our darkest valleys? One of the most profound statements in all of Scripture comes from Joseph's lips. "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." This ability to see God's hand, even in the most painful circumstances, is the pinnacle of spiritual maturity. Joseph did not minimize the wrong done to him. It was real and intentional, but he could see beyond human intentions to God's greater divine purpose. Ask yourself, can I see the hardships in my life through this lens? Can I believe that God can use even my deepest wounds, my most painful betrayals, for a greater good that I cannot yet fully see? Finally, Joseph's desire that his bones be carried back to Canaan speaks of hope beyond death. He lived and died in Egypt, but knew he did not belong there. His identity was tied to God's promise, not to his present success. As Christians, we are called to live with that same tension, We contribute to the society around us, as Joseph did in Egypt, but we know our true citizenship is in heaven. We live and work in the present world, but our hope is anchored in a promise not yet fully realized. The stories of Jacob and Joseph contain fascinating riches, often missed in casual reading. For example, Jacob's wrestling with the mysterious man at Jabbok, later identified as a divine manifestation, has deep geographical significance. The name Jabbok comes from a Hebrew root meaning to empty or to pour out, the river that had to be crossed before Jacob could return to the promised land. Spiritually, he had to be emptied of his trust in his own schemes before he could enter into his inheritance. The new name given to Jacob, Israel, has traditionally been translated as "he who struggles with God." However, modern linguistic analysis suggests it may also mean "may God prevail" or "God rules," reflecting not so much Jacob's strength, but his ultimate surrender to divine sovereignty. Joseph's story in Egypt gains historical credibility through archaeological discoveries. Egyptian records confirm that during the Second Intermediate Period, c. 1800–1550 BC, the likely period of Joseph, many Asiatics, Semites, rose to high-ranking positions in Egyptian government. Inscriptions describe severe famines and grain storage policies similar to those described in Genesis. The text mentions that Joseph was embalmed in the Egyptian manner, a process that lasted 70 days, as described in Genesis 53. This precise detail about Egyptian mummification practices suggests the author's familiarity with Egyptian customs, consistent with the tradition that Moses, educated in Pharaoh's court, compiled these stories. Theologically, Joseph is often seen as a type or foreshadowing of Christ. Consider the parallels: loved by his father, hated by his brothers, sold for pieces of silver, falsely accused, exalted from prisoner to prince, provider of bread for a starving world, reconciler of his family, savior who transforms evil into good. Joshua 24:32 records that Joseph's bones were indeed buried at Shechem on a plot of land that Jacob had purchased, fulfilling the promise made more than 400 years earlier. In 1902, archaeologists discovered a tomb at Shechem that some believe to be Joseph's final burial site, though this identification remains debated. A fascinating curiosity: when Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dreams, he uses a peculiar phrase, "Pharaoh's dream is one," indicating that the two distinct dreams, cows and ears of grain, conveyed the same message. The rabbis noted that the Hebrew phrase used, halom paro ehad hu, has the exact numerical value of 928, which is the same value as 7 years of abundance and 7 years of famine. Sheva shnei sova vesheva shnei rav. An additional layer of meaning encoded in the very text. We now reach the end of our journey through Genesis, the book of beginnings. From heavens and earth being formed to the family of Israel being formed. From creation to fall. From fall to promise. From promise to partial fulfillment, pointing toward a greater fulfillment yet to come. Genesis establishes the foundational themes that will echo throughout the entire biblical narrative: creation, fall, redemption, covenant. It presents the central problems of the human condition: separation from God, conflict between brothers, the search for identity and purpose, and it begins to reveal the divine plan to restore what was broken. In Genesis, we see the character of God revealed: creative, relational, just, merciful, faithful to his promises even when humans are unfaithful to theirs. We see the divine pattern of working not through perfect people, but through willing ones. People who, despite their flaws, respond to the call. Genesis does not end with a happy conclusion, but with an incomplete promise. The chosen people are in Egypt, not in Canaan. The blessing promised to all nations through Abraham's offspring has not yet been fulfilled. Joseph's bones await the return to the promised land. But the seeds have been planted, the promises have been made, the covenant has been established. The way has been prepared for what comes next. The Exodus, the law, the prophets, and finally, the one who would be the ultimate seed of Abraham, the Lion of Judah, the true Israel, the fulfillment of all God's promises. Genesis leaves us not with complete answers, but with an unshakable conviction. The God who began this story is faithful to complete it. The God who called is faithful to fulfill. The God who promised is faithful to accomplish. And so, the book of beginnings points us beyond itself to the God who is not only the beginning, but also the end, the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, the author and finisher of our faith. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And in the end, a new heaven and a new earth, where the promise of Eden will be fully restored, where the seed of the woman will have definitively crushed the serpent's head, where all nations will be blessed through the seed of Abraham, where God will dwell again with his people, and there will be no more curse. This is the great story that begins in Genesis, and into which we are invited to find our own place, our own beginning, our own journey of faith.